The bombardment sounded like the worst thunderstorm in the history of the world. But unlike a thunderstorm, it went on and on and on. For long days, that devil Ulysses S. Grant and his Yankee army had squatted outside Richmond, pounding away at the capital city of the Confederacy with their big guns. Half the buildings in town had been reduced to rubble, and untold numbers of Richmond citizens were dead, killed in the endless barrages. And still, the guns continued to roar. Rangy, raw-boned Luke Jensen felt the floor shake under his feet as shells fell not far from the building where he stood. It had been one of Richmond's genteel mansions, not far from the Capitol itself, but recently it had been taken over by the government. One particular part of the government, in fact. The Confederate Treasury. Luke was one of 8 men summoned tonight, for reasons unknown to them. They were waiting in what had been the parlor before the comfortable, overstuffed furniture was shoved aside and replaced by desks and tables. In the light of a couple smoky lamps, he glanced around at the other men. Some of them he knew, and some he didn't. The faces of all bore the same weary, haggard look, the expression of men who had been at war for too long and suffered too many defeats despite their best efforts. Luke knew that look all too well. He saw it in the mirror every time he got a chance to shave, which wasn't very often these days. For nearly 4 long years, he had worn Confederate gray. Ever since the day he had walked away from the hardscrabble farm tucked into the Ozark Mountains of southwestern Missouri and enlisted. Behind him, he'd left his father Emmett and his little brother Kirby, along with his mother and sister. It had been hard for Luke to leave his family, but he felt it was the right thing to do. Fighting for the Confederacy didn't mean a man held with slavery, although he figured that was what all those ignorant Yankees believed. Luke didn't believe at all in the notion of one man owning another. At the same time, he didn't think it was right for a bunch of northern politicians in by-God Washington City to be telling southern folks what they could and couldn't do, especially when it came to secession. The states had joined together voluntarily, back when they'd won their freedom from England. If some of them wanted to say, "Thanks, but so long," and go their own way, it seemed to Luke they had every right to do so. Even so, if they'd just kept on wrangling about it in the halls of Congress, Luke, like a lot of other Southerners, would have pretty much ignored it and gone on about his business. But Abraham Lincoln had to go and send the army marching into Virginia, and the battle along the creek called Bull Run was the last straw as far as Luke was concerned. He'd been raised to avoid trouble if he could, but when a Jensen saw something wrong going on, he couldn't just sit back and do nothing. So he'd been a soldier for 4 years, fighting against the northern aggressors, slogging along as an infantryman for a while, before his natural talents for tracking, shooting, and fighting got noticed, and he was made a scout and a sharpshooter. He knew 3 of the men waiting in the parlor with him were the same sort. Remy Duquesne, Dale Cardwell, and Edgar Milgard were good men, and if he was being sent on some sort of mission with them, Luke was fine with that. The other 4 had introduced themselves as Keith Stratton, Wiley Potter, Josh Richards, and Ted Casey. Luke hadn't formed an opinion about them based only on their names. He didn't blame them for being closed-mouthed, though. He was the same way himself. Remy fired up a cigar and said in his soft Cajun accent, "Anybody got an idea why they brought us here tonight?" "Not a clue," Wiley Potter said.